welcome back to my channel. I hope you're doing happy, amazing, and positive. Just a disclaimer that the following video is going to be quite disturbing. So if gruesome details, disturbing details is really not your thing, please click out. I've got a lot of other lighthearted content that you could watch. And also another disclaimer that every piece of information that I have found through documentaries, the internet, and news articles, news reports, things like that. So I do apologize if any of the information is inaccurate. I have done my best to really provide the most accurate information that I can. And also this following video is to create domestic and family violence awareness. This case is so vile and disgusting and so horrific that you almost start questioning, like, who else could be doing this? There could be people literally right under our noses that could be doing the same things, and we just don't even know about it. This case is going to teach us to be a bit more observant, to speak up if something doesn't feel right, to really tap into our intuition and listen to the signs, read all the signs. Even if you see something that doesn't quite look right and you report it and it gets looked into and it wasn't anything bad, at least you tried. At least you put in that initiative to make sure that everything was all good, especially if it involves children. So today I'm going to be talking about a man called David Alan Turpin and his wife Louise Ann Turpin. David met Louise when he was 18 and Louise would have been about 10 years old. But some reports say that David was actually 24 and she was 15. So it's just really hard to tell exactly how old they were when they met. But I do know that Louise was very young. They met at their Pentecostal church, and also David lived quite close by to Louise. So because they went to the same church, they lived quite close by, they would see each other all the time. They kind of started getting feelings for each other and started dating when she turned 15 years old. This really did not sit right with Louise's family because technically David being in a relationship with Louise was illegal. Because of all this disagreement around their relationship, Louise and David decided to elope when she turned 16 years old and David was 23. And one thing that kind of led Louise to leave her family home is because she actually went through a lot of abuse. So it is said that her sister Teresa and a couple of their cousins were actually sexually abused by their grandfather, and Louise's mother would actually condone it.
If ever there was any defense of Louise Turpin's future abusive behavior toward her own children, this is it. As little girls, she and Teresa were repeatedly sexually assaulted by their grandfather, and worse still, their own mother condoned and encouraged it.
My mom would take us to him daily. She was pretty much selling us for money to live on.
And they believe this is what kind of led Louise to continuing this whole cycle of abuse, because she had so much trauma in her life, which absolutely does not justify it, but unhealed trauma can create a whole cycle of abuse. That's another reason why she left her family home. So they eloped, and this made her father so angry. Her father was a pastor at their church. So he was furious at the fact that she had run away with David, and they didn't know where she went. Backtracking to David, David was quite a quiet, timid guy. He was a little on the nerdy side. He was overall a really, really good student because, I mean, he grew up to be a computer engineer. So he did really, really well in school. So when Louise's family alerted the police that David and Louise had run away, I mean, she was a minor. So technically, where does she go? She is not allowed to kind of just up and leave her whole life. So Louise's family contacted the police. So then a few days later, the police actually located Louise and David in Texas. When the family found them in Texas, they decided to not press any charges or anything like that and kind of just let them live their lives. When David and Louise got married in 1985, they settled in Fort Worth, Texas. One narrative, though, stays the same. David and Louise were very to themselves all the time. They didn't really interact with the neighbors. They didn't really talk to anyone. They were very just to themselves. While living in Fort Worth, Texas, David and Louise had 8 kids. But when they had 4 kids, so this is before the 8 kids, when they just had the 4 kids, one of Louise's sister came to stay with David and Louise. Her name was Elizabeth. Elizabeth was staying with them for a little while she got a few things sorted in her own life. One thing that was really strange was when Elizabeth moved in, Louise and David would say that she was not allowed to make any phone calls using their phone. She was not allowed to meet anyone. She was not really allowed to talk to anyone. She wasn't even allowed to have anyone over. So she was being controlled. And because of this control, like obviously you would feel really like uncomfortable living somewhere, but she was grateful that, you know, she had a place to stay, and obviously she was going to follow the rules of the people who she's staying, you know, using the house to live in. So she followed these rules. While Elizabeth was living there, she kind of started noticing like weird patterns and weird behaviors from David and Louise, especially towards the older child, the older daughter. They were exceptionally strict with her, to the point where the daughter would have to look into the mother's eyes and pretty much beg to eat. And she would have to get permission to sit down on the table, like on the dining table. She would have to get permission to speak. She couldn't even talk to her auntie Elizabeth without gaining permission from her parents first. And obviously Elizabeth was kind of like, what is going on? This is really weird. All the kids would often just stay in their bedrooms the whole time, unsupervised. David and Louise didn't really check in on them. They were just kind of to themselves. Elizabeth didn't even know what they were doing because they were just in a room. But Elizabeth kind of thought, okay, maybe it's just their strict way of parenting, and she didn't want to get in between that, because she was like, well, who is she to kind of say, oh, this is not right, you shouldn't be doing this? And obviously in hindsight, she looks back and she knows that this was really weird behavior and she should have spoken up about it. One day, Elizabeth was having a shower and Louise and David unlocked the bathroom door with a coat hanger, went in the bathroom and just watched Elizabeth have a shower and just stayed there till she finished. They just wouldn't get out. As much as she would say, like, what are you doing? Get out of here. They would not leave. Obviously, this made Elizabeth really, really uncomfortable. I don't think she really did much about it, to be honest. But I just feel like maybe Elizabeth felt like, if I say something and they kick me out, where am I going to go? So she kind of would have had to just, you know, keep a tight lip about everything. There wasn't much else about what Elizabeth saw in the home while she was living with them. I didn't even get any information on how long she was staying with them, but she did end up getting kicked out by Louise, because Louise found out that Elizabeth was talking to one of her friends from work, and Louise didn't like this. Louise didn't even want anyone to know where they lived. So Louise found this out and kicked her sister out and didn't see her sister after that. So in 1998, this is where things took a real big turn. Things just started becoming worse and worse by the day. Teresa said that she would often Skype the kids. She noticed that the kids didn't look their age. Like the older one looked a lot younger than her age. When Teresa started questioning Louise about why they look so young, Louise just said, oh, they're just growing up to be tall and lanky like their father. It's nothing. They're fine.
There was Skype for a while, and we would make comments. I remember making the comment that they were all so little. I remember Louise laughing it off and, well, they're just tall, going to be tall and lanky like David, but they didn't look severely malnourished. They looked healthy. They just looked small.
Teresa said that when they were on Skype, she felt like Louise was dressing up their kids in clothes that didn't make them seem skinnier. Teresa's alarm bells kind of started ringing, but not enough to look more into it. When Teresa started questioning Louise and David, that's when Louise decided that she was going to cut off all visual contact with her sister. So the only way that the family contacted Teresa was through phone. Louise thought, okay, this is getting a little bit too risky. it's only going to be phone. But even after a while, even that stopped. And even when they were on the phone with Teresa, they were only allowed to speak one at a time. The way that they spoke was very slow, and they couldn't really hold a proper conversation, like a back and forth conversation. But Teresa just thought maybe like they were just a little mentally underdeveloped. And that was it. They didn't really think much into it. So as time went on, and as David and Louise started having more and more kids, they stopped going to church. They said that they felt like they couldn't trust the church anymore. But the weird thing was that David and Louise started experimenting with weird rituals. So I'm talking they were doing like satanic rituals, experimenting with really, really dark things. And it's also said that they kind of made their like own religion by taking parts of other religions and morphing it into their one sort of homemade religion. One thing about Louise is that she never smoked a cigarette in her life. She never drank, neither did David. They were very just like religious people that lived by the Bible. But something turned and Louise started partying, smoking, drinking, and her and her husband started to go to like swingers clubs and stuff like that. So they started experimenting like sexual activity with other people and things like that. And this was totally weird because this was not Louise and David. This was not them. This is not the things that they would do. Louise even like contacted this guy over the internet, and they met up and they got a motel and they like slept together with David there too. It was just weird. Like, I mean, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but it was just weird going from so religious and living by the Bible to just doing a whole 180 and living this whole other lifestyle. Louise was the one who kind of started the abuse and participated more in the abuse. She was the one who kind of like wore the pants in the relationship. David was more of the quieter one. He still did participate in the abuse, but Louise was kind of like the lead in all of this. Despite David having a great job and earning a lot of money, for some reason he could not pay the mortgage. So they had to leave. Once they left, the new owners went into the house just to check it out. And what they found in that home was disgusting. The floors were covered, like the carpets were covered in filth. It just seemed like there was like urine, dirt, and feces. There were scratches on the walls that the owner assumed that animals did. She didn't even know that it was actually the kids doing this. So she walked in this entire mess, and it smelled, and it was just horrible. The carpets were gross. The walls were like they had feces on the walls. How do feces even get on the walls? So this home that they lived in Fort Worth was in a suburb. It was like normal, you know, neighborhood kind of thing. There were people next door to either side. For people to not have noticed something is really weird. Like, did they not notice that there were kids in the house and then they were not ever coming outside to play or things like that? Remember, this is before iPads and stuff like that. So it wasn't really normal for kids to just be stuck in the house all the time. In the year 2000, the couple and their 8 kids moved to rural Texas in a place called Rio Vista, which literally had a population of like 700 people. There was literally no one there, and the houses were spread apart big time. I think because they were so isolated from the other neighbors that they had more of a chance of doing what they wanted without being caught. So David and Louise had 4 more kids while they lived in Rio Vista, and this totaled them to have 12 kids at that time, and they lived in Rio Vista for 10 years. And the things that happened in those 10 years were so horrific, it is beyond imaginable. So at this time they had 12 kids, so the kids ranged from 2 to 29 years old. 29, that is a full-on adult. There was a 13th child, but she came much later when Louise was 47. So at this stage in the Rio Vista home, there were 12 kids altogether. Louise and David kept having kids because she said that God kept telling her to have more kids. God kept giving her more kids, and she was going to stop only when God let her stop. She said she would have 20 to 25 kids if she could. The Turpins seemed like a normal family on the surface. They would travel a lot. They would go to Disneyland. They would go to Vegas. In fact, they went to Vegas to renew David and Louise's wedding vows. And despite of how private they actually were, they would post pictures of them and their family like traveling on Facebook. I feel like this was a tactic to come across as normal and that they're living this lavish lifestyle. They're traveling, they're happy, just so that people didn't suspect there was any kind of abuse. Obviously, if you're looking on Facebook and people are posting pictures like this, you would think that they're like living a totally normal life. And even Louise's siblings thought, yeah, like they were strict, yeah, they were a bit weird, but they seemed like they were living a happy lifestyle. They seemed like they were treating the kids to travels. They really thought that things were quite normal with them. The sister Teresa even said, you know, Louise didn't marry handsome, but she married rich. And so obviously, naturally, you would think that they were living a great lifestyle and just happy as a family. David and Louise had a couple of run-ins with the cops, but they were over nothing really. Like one time, one of their 4-year-old kids got bitten by a border collie dog, and the police kind of looked into it, but they didn't find anything suspicious going on. Even the police didn't figure out that anything was going on for a long time. The abuse was horrific. Nobody knew how horrific this abuse was that all the kids were facing. The kids were rarely ever allowed to go out. They had a huge land. They could have been, you know, playing all the time, riding their bikes, stuff like that. The kids were only allowed to shower once a year. Once a whole year. They were homeschooled, but military style. David and Louise would often chain up their kids to furniture and the beds. Sometimes Louise would chain their kids up to the bed and wouldn't even let them go to the bathroom. And it got to that point where they needed to go to the bathroom so badly that they had no choice but to urinate and defecate where they were laying down. Even small things that the kids did would anger Louise and end up chaining their kids to the furniture. They would starve the kids. They were only given one meal per day. The parents would often tease the kids with food. So they would have all these beautiful pies and desserts all set up on like the kitchen countertop. But the parents said that the kids were not allowed to touch it. And obviously the kids would be starving and they would be looking at all this amazing food, literally like torturing their kids with all these foods in front of them that they were not even allowed to go near. While David and Louise would give them like peanut butter sandwiches or very like just basic food, David and Louise would be sitting in front of them eating these pies and all these beautiful foods, just absolutely torturing their kids. They would have like padlocks on the fridge doors and the cabinets and pantries and stuff like that so that none of the kids could go and steal food. And in fact, one time the 9-year-old went and tried to steal food, and she got caught by Louise. And Louise, as the punishment, grabbed the cat, threw the cat outside, and made her 9-year-old daughter watch her cat being eaten alive and just ripped apart by wild dogs. Can you imagine how traumatic that would have been for this 9-year-old girl? They were beaten, they were strangled, they were choked. One time she even caught one of the daughters watching a Justin Bieber video on a cell phone, and Louise caught her and started choking the daughter and just saying things like, "Do you want to die? Yes, I think you want to die and go to hell." Just tortured her just for watching a Justin Bieber music video. One time the 17-year-old even got sexually abused by her father. He pulled her pants down and made her sit on his lap and tried to kiss her on the mouth several times. They were so malnourished that the 17-year-old girl looked as though she was 10 years old. They were so skinny to the point where they had muscle waist. Their body was literally eating them alive. All the kids looked much younger than their age. The 29-year-old looked like she was a 17-year-old girl. The parents would even buy them toys, but would leave them in the box so that the kids were not allowed to play with them. The kids were not allowed to touch them, but they would be laying, like the boxes would be laying around, so the kids would be like craving to play with these toys, but they were not allowed to. Even new bicycles, like new bikes that they bought, that they were not even allowed to ride, which, why buy it in the first place if you're not even going to allow your kids to ride it? Like, why torture them so much to have something that you want so badly? The parents were absolutely doing evil things on top of what they were already doing. The kids were not even allowed to talk to each other. They had to either lay down or sit up on their bed, like where they were. They were not allowed to stand up on the floor. Mind you, the floor was full of junk. There was no floor space to even walk around. And also the kids had to call their parents by mother and father. They were asked to treat their parents in a very like formal way. When the family first moved to this rural Texas house, they were allowed to play outside, very rarely though. And the neighbors kind of got excited because they were like, oh, there's other kids there. Now my kids have other kids to play with.
Thought it was going to be great. Our kids are finally going to have some other kids to play with. We're out in the country. We're by ourselves and lonely, and we thought we were going to have some nice neighbors.
But the neighbors quickly started realizing that something was really off. So one time, one of the neighbors, while their kids were playing with the Turpin kids, the neighbor noticed that one of the girl's arms or hands was quite white in color, quite pale, to the point where she thought that this child was wearing gloves.
And I said, whoa, I thought you had gloves on there for a minute. And she goes, you wash to the wrist or else you're wasting water. And the way she spoke was really strange, like she might be a little slow.
And mind you, can you imagine like kids that have been just stuck in their home without getting any vitamin D from the sun or anything like that? They would be so pale and so deprived of any kind of vitamin. The neighbors started getting a gut feeling that their kids should not be hanging out with the Turpin kids. So they stopped their kids from communicating with the Turpin family. So the neighbors noticed all this stuff, but didn't grow enough suspicion to report it. The neighbor even said, you know, they were kind of to themselves. She wanted to respect their privacy. She just thought maybe they were a little strange. This is one thing that kind of made me a little like annoyed, is when the Turpin kids were going to school, this is before their homeschooling, they would get teased by other kids saying that they smelled weird, they dressed weird, they didn't look normal, their haircuts were weird. Like they would get teased. And this is initially what Louise says is the reason why she decided to homeschool their kids. But I totally don't believe that it was because of that. I believe that Louise started homeschooling their kids because she wanted to hide the abuse. And it was easier to hide the abuse at home than obviously if she was letting her kids go to school, because the kids did start noticing weird things about the Turpin kids. I don't know, it's like, didn't the teachers notice that there was something weird going on? I mean, maybe they didn't want to invade their privacy or give in to like all the bullying that was going on and look into it. But I don't know, I just feel like something could have and should have been done. So even when the neighbors started noticing that things weren't right, David and Louise started noticing that the neighbors kind of withdrew their kids from the Turpin kids. This is when David and Louise completely stopped letting their kids go out to play. So one time when all the kids were inside the house, one of the kids actually managed to escape. And she was running down the street when a neighbor asked what she was doing, and the neighbor kind of didn't really listen to this child because the child was so malnourished and didn't speak normally that this lady thought that she was just a mentally underdeveloped child and took her back to the home. This poor child is trying to ask for help, is trying to get help to save her siblings, and this neighbor just assumed that she was mentally underdeveloped or there was something wrong with her and took her back. Like, imagine that feeling that you finally managed to escape escape and you're so close to getting that help, but this person doesn't believe you and takes you back to your torture house. That would just be the absolute worst feeling, like just a glimmer of that light at the end of the tunnel, and it's just taken away. So apparently money problems once again forced the Turpin family to move out of their Rio Vista home. To be honest, I don't believe that it could have been money. I mean, it probably was money issues, but I kind of believe that the neighbors knew, like one kid tried to escape and, you know, the other neighbors found them to be not normal and, you know, kind of knew some disturbing things were going on. So I have a feeling that they moved out because things were getting a bit too risky. The Turpin family then moved to Paris, California. And when they moved, one of the people that lived in Rio Vista actually bought the house that the Turpin family used to live in. And when they went in, they discovered yet again a gruesome scene. They discovered feces everywhere, urine everywhere on the carpets, on the beds. The mattresses were literally like rotting. It was so dirty. There were like padlocks and chains on closets. The closet had like vents. So it seemed as though that the kids were put in these closets and like locked up in there. There were chains on the beds, so it looked like they were being chained to the bunk beds and chained to like bits of furniture. There was like dead rats and dead cats everywhere. There was just filth. It was just so dirty. They were just hoarding all this junk. They found like desks like lined up, like full on, you know, school style. There was like a whiteboard, but it was just broken. Like it just looked absolutely run down, as if someone had just like smashed things up and they were just like robbed or something, and everything was just everywhere. Some beds didn't even have mattresses. So it makes me wonder, were the Turpin kids forced to sleep on just the bed frame without any mattresses? So obviously like the people that were looking in the house, they already thought that the Turpin family was weird, but seeing everything the way that the house was just confirmed that there were some disturbing things going on in that home, and instantly they regretted not reporting anything. So the family then moved to Paris, California. Yes, they moved around a lot. It is said they moved like 8 times to 8 different houses, but that number has not been confirmed. So when they moved to Paris, California, they actually lived in 2 different houses. So one time they lived in this like double-story home where they named like the Sandcastle Private something, just to like show the government that it was a school, like a private school. And then they had another home, like a 1-story home as well, which they moved into later on. In the double-story house, one of the neighbors would actually have this graveyard shift at his work, and he would come home between like 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. He would see these kids just like through the window up like on their top level, just like marching back and forth in a straight line between room to room. Like, I'm sorry, but if you're seeing kids marching in a straight line in the middle of the night when they should be asleep, when people should be asleep, isn't that an indication that maybe you should say something? Maybe like go knock on the door and ask what is going on, or maybe anonymously pick up the phone and call authorities and say there's some weird things going on in this house. Like, I'm sorry, if I saw my neighbor's kids walking around back and forth in a line, I would be like, what the heck is going on? That is weird. And I would probably wake up someone in my house and take them with me to go check what's going on. As if you didn't think to like check in, you know? It just makes me so mad, because you know that it's weird. You know that it's weird enough to talk about it later on in the media, but you don't do anything about it in the moment. So what's the point? What's the point of you talking about it when you didn't do anything? When they were in their second home, the kids were actually planning to escape for 2 years, but they were too afraid to leave. So one night, one of the sisters, the 17-year-old sister, heard her little sister complaining because she had been chained up to the bunk bed. And she was saying to her 17-year-old sister, like, these chains are hurting. We need to get help. I need to get out of these chains. She was in these chains all night. Just imagine like how much it would hurt having steel chains on you. Her bones are already so fragile. It just breaks my heart to think that these poor kids were chained up for so long. You know, they were just so conditioned to believe for so long that this was like a normal way of living. They didn't really know any better, but I think obviously down the track they started realizing that this is really not normal. So when the 17-year-old heard her sister complaining, she was like, enough is enough. This is not right. Like, I need to get help. So on January 14th, 2018, just before 6 a.m., the 17-year-old daughter and the 13-year-old daughter managed to open a window and get out. And while they were running, the 13-year-old got really nervous and anxious, and she got too scared and told her sister that she doesn't want to do this. She's too scared. So she ran back into the house, but the 17-year-old kept running. Luckily, she took her mother's deactivated mobile phone with her as she left the house. As she got to a safe distance from the home, she dialed 911. I'm going to play the 911 clip in a second. But the dispatcher thought that this wasn't real. You'll probably hear it in her voice as well. I certainly did. I was like, this 911 dispatcher is very just monotone. If you're hearing like a child call, usually you hear dispatchers saying sweetie and honey or something like that, just to put the child at ease. But the dispatcher was just very monotone, and later on it is said that she just didn't think that this was real. She just was like, okay, this is probably a prank or something. Also, you'll hear it as well, the 17-year-old literally sounded like an 8-year-old on the phone. So I'm going to play the 911 clip now.
Okay, I live in a family of 15 people, and my parents are abusing. They abuse us, and my 2 little sisters right now are chained up.
And how many of your siblings are tied up?
2 of my sisters, 1 of my brothers. We live in still, and sometimes I wake up and I can't breathe because how dirty the house is.
When was the last time you had a bath?
I don't know, almost a year ago.
Does anybody at the house take any kind of medication?
Oh, I don't know what medication is.
Are you homeschooled?
No, we don't do school. Our mother tells people we'll homeschool. Our mother tells people we're private schools, and she has a fake private school set up. But we don't really do school. I haven't finished first grade, and I'm 17. Hi.
Is that the deputy?
Yes.
Go talk to him, okay?
Also in the clip, she did mention that she doesn't know much about her mother. Her mother doesn't spend much time with her. She also mentioned that she doesn't know much about the streets. She didn't even really know where she was. She did not know her address.
She'd never seen a police officer, didn't know what a hospital or medication was. But her brave act meant finally the 13 prisoners were free.
If you didn't know that she was 17, you would absolutely think that she was like a 7-8-year-old child. So she spoke to the 911 operator for about 20 minutes until the deputy arrived. And you can hear the relief in her voice when she says hi to the deputy. It honestly was so courageous of this young girl to run out the way that she did, knowing the risk, knowing what could have happened to her if she got caught. She saved her 13 siblings, you know. She is a true hero. I'm just so glad that she gained that courage to leave and get help. So before the deputy went inside the house, the 17-year-old showed some pictures that she had of some of her siblings chained up. And the deputy went towards the house, and as he was at the door, Louise was in the process of unchaining 2 of the girls. But when the deputy went inside, he found the son still chained up. David and Louise were shocked as to why the deputy was there. Straight away, the deputies find all the kids. They were so malnourished. They knew there was an immense amount of abuse. The deputies even said that this was the worst case of child abuse that they have ever seen. And this has honestly gone down as one of the worst case of child abuse in all of American history. When the deputies saw all the kids, they initially thought that all the kids were minors because of how malnourished they were. They saw the 29-year-old, they thought that she was like a young teenager. She only weighed 37 kilos. I can't even comprehend that. The deputy said that the house had such a foul smell. It was so dirty. They were hoarding all this junk. There was just junk everywhere. 6 of the children were under 18 years old, and they just described the whole scene as horrific. One thing that the kids were allowed to do were keep journals, and the parents would buy them journals that they were allowed to write in, and the deputies discovered hundreds of these journals. But luckily, they were allowed to keep these journals that had all the gruesome details of what was going on in those kids' lives. These kids wrote about all the abuse that these kids endured for so many years of their lives. Some of the kids experienced it from the moment that they were born. So all their lives, they didn't know anything outside of this abuse. So these journals were later used as evidence. David and Louise were arrested at the scene.
Neighbors say they are simply in shock.
It seemed that the mother was perplexed as to why we were at that residence.
And initially they pled not guilty. Some of the attorneys realized that if they go through a whole trial, they're going to put the kids under so much trauma yet again, having to relive that. They communicated that with the parents, and later on in Feb of 2019, so over a year and a bit later, the parents decided to plead guilty and accepted the maximum sentence, which is life in prison with the possibility of parole in 25 years. So in 2044, they would be allowed to apply for parole. I do not think that that is anywhere long enough. I think they should just spend the rest of their lives rotting in jail. In the courtroom, David and Louise read their statements. David even had to get his attorney to read his statement for him because he was so hysterical and he was crying, and Louise was crying. In David's statement, it read that he was so sorry and he never meant to hurt the kids. All this stuff. It's like, you never meant to hurt the kids, but yeah, you were chaining them up for all of their lives. You were tormenting them with great food, giving them basic food. You malnourished them. You were starving them. You were almost killing them. You were choking them. You were sexually abusing them. Yet you never meant to hurt them. So it just clicked to you now when you got caught that you were never meant to hurt them. I'm sorry, in my opinion, you are sorry that you got caught. You are sorry that people realize how disgusting and vile you both were as parents. Sorry, but that statement screamed BS to me. He even says in his statement that he hopes to hug his children one day. Some of the kids even gave their statements too, and these kids were so beautiful in their statements. These kids just expressed that they still love their parents, that yes, it was a nightmare that they lived in, but they're taking their life back and they're not going to let that whole thing define who they are. They even had a 2-year-old child, I think, who was actually adopted. There was a baby in their family, which I'm so glad that she would never have to endure any of the abuse or remember any of the abuse in her life either. The kids had a restraining order against the parents as well. One thing that really melted my heart is that the son said that who he was because of his parents, and he forgives them and he loves them and he's moving on. For a child to forgive his parents of all that torment is so mature, is so beautiful. It just goes to show how beautiful these kids were and how wise they were. So how are the kids, you might be wondering? What are they up to? What's going on in their lives? And one thing I'm so happy about is I know that I do a lot of murder cases and stuff like that. You know, all my other true crime videos have been about murder. But this one has a really positive ending. The kids have really grown into independence. All siblings are doing really, really well. The older siblings are actually now living in apartments. The kids are getting educated. Some of the kids have been adopted. They see each other often. They always get together. They're still very close. They get around on public transport. They are living their lives. And, you know, yes, their lives were stripped away from them for all those years, but they have absolutely not let what happened to them define them. They have been moving on and they built a life for themselves. They are happy. So yes, this story does have a very, very happy ending, but this was, you know, one of the worst cases I've ever come across that I just knew I had to cover, because family violence and domestic violence do tie in to each other. So that was it for today, guys. I hope you learned something in this video. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I hope to see you guys here next week. Please stay happy, amazing, and positive, and I shall catch you next week. Bye.